"You don't deserve to be here, Sarah. Everyone knows my son succeeded despite you, not because of you." Those words, spoken loudly enough for half the graduation crowd to hear, froze me in place. My mother-in-law's perfectly manicured finger jabbed into my chest as she delivered what she thought would be the final blow to my dignity. Little did she know, this was the moment I'd stop playing the dutiful daughter-in-law after 15 years of emotional torture. I can still picture the scene perfectly. The sea of graduation caps and gowns, proud families clutching bouquets and balloons, and my son Jacob standing 20 feet away, his achievement day now marred by this public spectacle. His eyes met mine with that familiar look, the one begging me to just let it go, to keep the peace as I always had. But something snapped inside me that day. Maybe it was the culmination of 15 years of snide remarks about my working-class background. Maybe it was the way my father-in-law nodded along to his wife's verbal assault. His expensive watch glinting in the May sunshine, the same watch I knew for a fact they couldn't afford. Or maybe it was simply that I was done being everyone's doormat while they walked all over me in their designer shoes purchased with maxed-out credit cards. What happened next changed our family dynamic forever. And honestly, I don't regret a single word. I met David Thompson during my final year of nursing school. He came from old money, or so his parents Eleanor and Richard wanted everyone to believe. They lived in a sprawling colonial in Newton, Massachusetts, drove luxury cars, and belonged to the kind of country club where membership costs more than most people's mortgages. Eleanor never let me forget that I grew up in a double wide in western Massachusetts, the daughter of a factory worker and a waitress. When David proposed, Eleanor's first words weren't congratulations but concern about whether we'd have a suitable wedding. "We have standards to maintain in this family," she'd said, examining my modest engagement ring with barely concealed disappointment. Despite my reservations, I loved David. He was kind, brilliant, and seemed nothing like his status-obsessed parents. We married in a ceremony that still managed to be hijacked by Eleanor's insistence on traditions I couldn't afford. I'll never forget her comment at our rehearsal dinner. "Well, we had to step in. We couldn't have David's colleagues thinking he married into simplicity." I tried, God knows I tried. 4 years I baked the perfect pies for Thanksgiving, bought thoughtful Christmas gifts, and listened to Eleanor's thinly veiled criticisms about everything from my career. Nursing is so hands-on, isn't it? To how we were raising Jacob. In our family, children typically attend private schools. What the Thompsons didn't know was that I managed our household finances. David was a talented architect but terrible with money, a trait I soon realized he'd inherited from his parents. While Eleanor and Richard projected wealth, I started noticing the cracks in their facade. The late payment notices I accidentally saw when helping organize their mail, the hushed arguments about credit card bills when they thought no one was listening. David and I lived modestly despite his good income. We saved for Jacob's college fund from the day he was born. We paid off our mortgage early. We built real security while his parents built an elaborate house of cards. As Jacob grew into a bright, compassionate young man, Eleanor and Richard took credit for every achievement. His academic scholarships, Thompson intelligence, his kind nature, our family values. When he got accepted to Cornell on a partial merit scholarship, Eleanor actually said, "Blood will tell, won't it?" As if my DNA was something that had to be overcome. What hurt most was watching Jacob navigate these choppy waters. He loved his grandparents but sensed their conditional approval. I'd catch him altering small details about his life to please them, downplaying friendships with unsuitable kids or emphasizing the connections he was making with the right families at school. The summer before his senior year, Jacob and I had a heart-to-heart on our back porch. "Mom, why do you let Grandma and Grandpa talk to you that way?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Family is complicated, honey," I said, the standard answer I'd given for years. "But you're the one who taught me to stand up for myself and others," he countered. "You're the one who showed me how to be strong." His words haunted me for months. What example was I setting? That it was okay to be belittled if the person doing it was family? That appearances mattered more than authenticity? By Jacob's graduation day, something had been building inside me for months. A reckoning was coming. I just didn't know it would happen in front of 3,000 people. The day started perfectly. May in Ithaca's beautiful campus in full bloom. Lake Cayuga sparkling in the distance. David and I arrived early to get good seats, with Eleanor and Richard joining us fashionably late, making a grand entrance in matching Burberry trench coats. We almost didn't make it, Eleanor announced. The hotel lost our reservation for the presidential suite. Can you imagine? Richard had to remind them who we were. I smiled tightly, already exhausted by the performance. David squeezed my hand under the program booklet. Mom, why don't you tell Sarah about that charity gala you're chairing? David suggested, always the peacemaker. Oh, I doubt Sarah would understand the complexities, Eleanor responded with a practiced laugh. It's quite exclusive. The governor might attend. Before I could respond, the ceremony began. Watching Jacob walk across that stage, I felt a pride so overwhelming it brought tears to my eyes. His future was bright, a job lined up at an environmental engineering firm in Boston, an apartment already secured with friends. He'd done it all himself, working summer jobs, maintaining his scholarship, networking at industry events. After the ceremony, we gathered near the Arts Quad for photos. Jacob was radiant, surrounded by friends who clearly adored him. I noticed Eleanor pulling him aside, straightening his honor cords, positioning him away from some of his friends who didn't fit her image of success. Let's get some photos with just family, she commanded, dismissing Jacob's roommate Marcus, who'd been like a brother to him for 4 years. Actually, Grandma, Marcus's family, Jacob said firmly, putting his arm around his friend. Eleanor's mouth tightened, but she acquiesced with a strained smile. That's when Richard started in. Well, Jacob, now that you've graduated, we should talk about getting you properly connected. Those engineering firms are fine for starting out, but with the Thompson name, you could be at Goldman Sachs. I've already mentioned you to Bradley Winters. Dad, David warned quietly. I'm happy with my job, Grandpa, Jacob replied. Environmental engineering is what I'm passionate about. Passion doesn't buy country club memberships, son. Richard chuckled, slapping Jacob's back too hard. I saw Jacob's smile falter. 4 years of hard work, and they were already dismissing his choices. Jacob's job is perfect for him, I interjected. He'll be making a real difference. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Yes, well, making a difference is nice, but building the right life takes more strategic thinking. Something our family understands. Our family values security and happiness, I countered, feeling my resolve strengthen. Jacob has both. Sarah, Eleanor said with exaggerated patience, there are certain expectations when you're a Thompson. Jacob needs guidance from people who understand his background. His background, I repeated, my voice dangerously quiet. Well, yes. His Thompson background. He's half Warren, too, I reminded her, naming my own family. Eleanor laughed, that tinkling, rehearsed sound she used at her social functions. Oh, Sarah, let's be realistic about what each side has contributed to Jacob's success. I felt David tense beside me. Even he, who'd spent a lifetime making excuses for his parents, seemed uncomfortable with their behavior. Mom, not today, he murmured. I'm simply pointing out that there's a reason Jacob has excelled, Eleanor continued, warming to her theme. The Thompson connections, the Thompson intelligence, the Thompson ambition. Each word was a knife. 15 years of knives, actually all twisting at once. Maybe, Richard added, checking his Patek Philippe watch, we should discuss Jacob's next steps over dinner. We've made reservations at La Scale. Sarah, you might want to change into something more appropriate. I looked down at my carefully chosen navy dress, the most expensive piece of clothing I owned, purchased specifically for this day. What's wrong with what I'm wearing? I asked, though I knew. It's just a bit department store, Eleanor said with faux sympathy. The restaurant has standards. That's when Jacob stepped in. Grandpa, please stop. Mom looks beautiful. And I wouldn't be here without her. Eleanor's face hardened. Jacob, you don't understand. We've had to compensate for certain limitations in your upbringing. Your success is despite, not because of. And that's when she said it. The words that finally broke the dam. You don't deserve to be here, Sarah. Everyone knows my son succeeded despite you, not because of you. The crowd around us grew quiet. Several of Jacob's friends stared in shock. David's face went white. Mom, he hissed. That's enough. But Eleanor was on a roll, years of barely concealed contempt finally flowing freely. We've carried this family for years, she continued. We've maintained appearances, kept up standards, made sure Jacob had proper opportunities despite his mother's modest contributions. I felt a strange calm settle over me. 15 years of holding my tongue, of keeping the peace, of protecting Jacob from the full toxicity of his grandparents' worldview, all of it suddenly seemed like a terrible mistake. Modest contributions. I repeated slowly. Would those be contributions like paying for Jacob's SAT prep courses when you said you would but then forgot? Or maybe you mean when I worked double shifts to afford his science camp because your promise check never arrived? Eleanor blinked, momentarily thrown off script. That's not. Or perhaps, I continued, my voice growing stronger. You mean the time you promised to help with his first yearbooks but had a mysterious financial emergency? Richard stepped forward, his face flushing. Now see here. No, Richard, you see here, I interrupted, surprising even myself. For 15 years I've watched you two parade around in designer clothes, brag about luxury vacations, and look down on me for being practical with money, all while you've been drowning in debt. A hushed murmur spread through the small crowd that had gathered. Jacob looked stunned but not entirely displeased. David put a hand on my arm, not to stop me, I realized, but in solidarity. Sarah, you have no idea what you're talking about, Eleanor sputtered, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide her growing alarm. I know exactly what I'm talking about. 3 remortgages on your house in the last decade. 6 maxed-out credit cards. A $42,000 tax lien that you begged David to help with last year, which we did, by the way, from our modest savings account. Richard's face had gone from red to ashen. This is private family business, he growled. So was my parenting, I countered. But you made that public just now, didn't you? I turned to face not just Eleanor and Richard, but the small circle of onlookers, including several of Jacob's friends and their parents. Let me tell you about modest contributions, I said, my voice clear and steady. While the Thompsons were buying status symbols they couldn't afford, I was teaching Jacob the value of hard work and financial responsibility. While they were charging designer clothes, I was showing him how to budget. While they were remortgaging their house to maintain appearances, David and I were saving for his education. I looked directly at Jacob, whose expression had transformed from embarrassment to something like pride. The real Thompson legacy isn't wealth or status, Jacob. It's smoke and mirrors. It's crushing debt hidden behind Rolex watches and country club memberships. It's valuing what people think over what's actually true. That's quite enough. Eleanor tried to interrupt, but her authority had evaporated. No, it's not enough, I continued, because Jacob deserves to know the truth before he builds his life on your values. Your house is underwater. Your retirement accounts are empty. The charity galas and the European vacations? All funded by credit cards with astronomical interest rates. I turned back to my in-laws, whose expressions had moved from anger to genuine fear. I've kept your secrets for years because I thought family protected family. But I realize now that real protection is about truth, not facades. Real love is accepting people for who they are, not who you wish they were. I felt David's hand on my shoulder, a gesture of support I hadn't expected. "She's right," David said quietly. "Mom, Dad, this has to stop. The lies, the pretense, the looking down on Sarah when she's the one who's actually built something real." Eleanor looked as though she might faint. Richard was frantically checking his phone, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Jacob stepped forward, positioning himself firmly by my side. "Grandma, Grandpa," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I love you, but Mom's right. I've always known something wasn't adding up with the way you talk about money versus how worried you sometimes seem. I don't care about country clubs or connections. I care about honesty." Eleanor's carefully constructed composure crumbled. For the first time in 15 years, I saw a real emotion on her face: shame. "You don't understand," she whispered. "We had expectations to meet. Standards. Your grandfather's legacy was built on the same kind of deception," David finished for her. "I've always known, Mom. Dad's father did the same thing, leveraged everything, lived beyond his means, passed the debt burden to his children. I broke that cycle thanks to Sarah." A heavy silence fell over our small group. In the background, other families continued their celebrations, unaware of the implosion happening in our little corner of the quad. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice hoarse. "What do you expect us to do? Declare bankruptcy at our age? Sell the house?" For the first time, I felt a twinge of pity. They were in their 70s, with nothing but debt to show for decades of keeping up appearances. "I expect you to stop judging me and my family," I said firmly. "I expect you to finally acknowledge the choices you've made and stop blaming others for their consequences. And most of all, I expect you to see Jacob for who he really is, not as a status symbol or a Thompson legacy, but as an incredible young man who deserves authentic relationships." The silence that followed felt eternal. Students and families continued streaming past us, laughing and celebrating, oblivious to our family's watershed moment. Eleanor was the first to break. Not with anger or denial, but with something I'd never witnessed from her before: vulnerability. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice barely audible. "Richard's father always said appearance was everything. Fake it till you make it. Except, we never made it." Richard stared at the ground, the fight gone out of him. The first loan seemed so manageable. Then the market turned in '08, and we were underwater. Rather than admit it, "You doubled down," David finished. "Just like you've done my entire life." Jacob, always the peacemaker, a trait he got from his father, stepped forward. "Maybe we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." I nodded, suddenly aware that we'd aired 15 years of family dysfunction in the middle of Cornell University's graduation celebrations. We walked in silence to a quiet coffee shop just off campus. The tension was palpable as we settled into a corner booth. Jacob sat beside me, with David on my other side, a united front I'd never experienced with my husband when it came to his parents. "You've humiliated us," Eleanor finally said, but the usual venom was missing from her voice. "No, Mom," David responded gently. "You humiliated yourselves. And you've been humiliating Sarah for years, while she kept your secrets." "We never asked her to keep our financial situation private," Richard protested weakly. I couldn't help but laugh. "You didn't have to ask. Your entire relationship with us is built on the unspoken agreement that we'll all pretend you're wealthy and successful, that I'll accept being looked down upon because, in your worldview, my background makes me inherently less valuable." Jacob reached for my hand under the table and squeezed it. "Grandma, Grandpa," he said carefully, "I've always known Mom was the financial backbone of our family. She's the one who taught me about investing, about living within my means, about building real security instead of just the appearance of it." Eleanor flinched. "We only wanted what was best for you, Jacob." "The best thing for Jacob is honesty," I said firmly. "Not pretending to be something we're not." Richard, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet, finally looked up. For a man who'd spent decades projecting confidence and superiority, he suddenly appeared every one of his 76 years. "What would you have us do?" he asked, and I was surprised to hear genuine inquiry in his voice rather than sarcasm. David and I exchanged glances. We'd actually discussed this scenario many times over the years, knowing that eventually the house of cards would collapse. "First, you need to be honest with yourselves and with us," David said. "No more hidden credit cards, no more secret loans. Everything on the table. Then," I continued, "you need professional help. Not just financial planning, but counseling to understand why maintaining appearances became more important than actual security." Eleanor bristled. "We don't need a psychiatrist to tell us." "Yes, you do," Jacob interrupted gently. "Grandma, this isn't normal. It's not healthy to mortgage your future for the sake of impressing people today." For perhaps the first time ever, Eleanor seemed to really look at her grandson not as an extension of the Thompson name, but as a wise young man with perspective she lacked. "When did you get so insightful?" she asked, a hint of genuine admiration in her voice. "He had an excellent teacher," David said, putting his arm around me. Richard cleared his throat. "And practically speaking, the house, the debts?" "You'll need to downsize," I said plainly. "The house is too big for you anyway, and the maintenance is killing your budget. With the equity, what's left of it, you could buy a comfortable condo outright and eliminate your mortgage. Leave Newton." Eleanor looked horrified. "But our friends, our community. Real friends would support you through a financial transition," Jacob pointed out. "And if they wouldn't, are they actually friends?" A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek, another first in my 15 years of knowing her. Her perfectly manicured hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. "We've made such a mess," she whispered. David leaned forward. "It's not too late to fix it, Mom. We can help you not with blank checks but with guidance. With support through the hard changes." "Why would you help us?" Richard asked. "Especially Sarah, after how we've treated her." I considered his question carefully. Why would I help them? They'd belittled me, undermined my parenting, and made me feel inadequate at every turn. "Because that's what family does," I finally said. "Real family, not the kind that's concerned with appearances, but the kind that shows up when things are difficult. I didn't have much growing up, but I had parents who taught me that." Eleanor's eyes met mine, really met them, perhaps for the first time without judgment or calculation. "I've been horrible to you," she admitted. "Yes," I agreed, not unkindly. "But today can be a new beginning if you want it to be." Jacob, always quick to find the bright side, smiled. "Think of it this way, Grandma, you won't have to pretend anymore. Do you know how exhausting it's been watching you stress about maintaining this image? Every vacation, every dinner out, I could see the worry behind your eyes while you tried to act carefree." Eleanor looked startled. "You noticed that?" "Of course he did," David said. "Jacob notices everything. Another trait he got from his mother." For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of 15 years of pretense and resentment slowly beginning to lift. It wouldn't be easy. Decades of financial mismanagement couldn't be fixed overnight, and relationship patterns were even harder to change. But for the first time, I felt like we were all standing on solid ground, seeing each other clearly. "Well," Richard said finally, "this isn't how I expected graduation day to go." A surprised laugh escaped me. "Me neither." "If you're serious about helping us," Eleanor said hesitantly, I think we'd be grateful." Coming from Eleanor, this was equivalent to moving mountains. Jacob beamed. "This is the best graduation gift I could have asked for my whole family. Finally being real with each other." As we left the coffee shop and headed toward the restaurant, a more modest choice than La Scale, selected by Jacob, I felt David's arm slip around my waist. "I'm sorry it took me so long to stand up to them," he murmured. Better late than never, I replied, leaning into his embrace. Ahead of us, I watched Jacob walking between his grandparents, gesturing animatedly as he explained something about his new job. For the first time, Eleanor and Richard seemed to be truly listening to him, not just waiting for opportunities to redirect or control the conversation. The facade had cracked, but what was emerging might actually be stronger than the brittle shell that had contained it. Real connection, real family, real worth. As Eleanor caught my eye and offered a tentative smile, I realized something important. Sometimes the most valuable thing we can give our children isn't protection from conflict, but the courage to face it honestly. Jacob had learned that lesson today, watching his mother finally stand in her truth. And that was worth more than all the Thompson appearances combined.